Okay, so getting right into it today, we're looking at a court sentencing document, um, and it's a high-profile one, the case of Huw Edwards. Now, some of you might recognize that name. He was a pretty big name in British broadcasting.
Yeah, he was a familiar face on TV for years, and that's actually what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's not just about the legal battle, but about the man behind the public persona.
Exactly. And to be totally transparent here, this case involves, well, it's a tough one. It involves possession of indecent images of children. And so everyone's on the same page. These images are categorized as A, B, and C.
And those categories, they're not just legal terms, right?
Yeah.
They reflect the severity of the abuse depicted in the images, Category A being the most severe.
All right, we're talking about real children, real victims here. And the sentencing document, it emphasizes the potential consequences. We're talking serious time here, like up to 10 years in prison.
10 years, that's a long time. And I think it speaks to how seriously these offenses are viewed by the justice system.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. What exactly did the prosecution present against Edwards? Well, according to the documents, he was charged with possessing numerous images. And to make matters worse, some of these involved moving images, which the court considers even more serious.
Right, and there's another layer to this whole thing. It turns out there's a connection between Edwards and another individual, Alex Williams, who was also convicted of similar offenses.
And that's where things start to get really complicated. See, Edwards, he claims he never actively sought out these images. He says he didn't solicit them, he didn't pay for them. He's saying his interactions with this Williams guy, which apparently started back in 2018 on Instagram, were harmless, or at least misconstrued.
Yeah, the document actually mentions that Edwards claims he cautioned Williams against sending images of, underage individuals. He's insisting any money he sent Williams' way was just like a friendly gesture, not a payment for anything inappropriate.
But the judge, well, it doesn't seem like they were entirely convinced by that explanation.
Right. Yeah, you're right. The judge, they weren't just going to take his word for it. They actually pointed to this, well, they called it a clear inference from the communication between Edwards and Williams, basically suggesting that, Williams was kind of fishing for gifts after sending those images. And Edwards, well, he sent them.
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction the judge is making there, because it moves the case beyond simply possessing the images. It makes it about the nature of Edwards' involvement, which brings us to this whole other thing, the Newton hearing.
Okay, now I'll admit, I had to brush up on my legal jargon for this one. What exactly is a Newton hearing? So imagine a mini trial, like within the main trial. It's where the judge hears evidence, testimony, all that, to try and figure out disputed facts. In this case, it was all about Edwards and Williams' stories, right? Trying to figure out, was Edwards really in the dark about the images, or was there something more going on?
So the judge had a lot to consider her, weighing the evidence, trying to understand this online relationship, and at the end of the day, deciding who they believed.
And we can't forget about the whole other layer here, which is Edwards' mental state at the time of the offenses. It's not just about guilt or innocence at this point, but understanding the context of his actions.
That's right, because the reports, the psychological evaluations ordered by the court, they paint a whole other picture here. We're talking about evaluations from both a psychiatrist and a psychosexual therapist.
And these weren't, just quick checkups. These were in-depth reports looking at his personal history, his mental health. We're talking diagnoses of depression, anxiety. He was even diagnosed with a cerebrovascular disease, which can actually affect cognitive function.
It's like they peeled back the layers of this public figure and found a man struggling with, well, a lot. There's this one part in Dr. Isaac's report, he talks about Edwards experiencing like cognitive dissonance and low self-esteem, which might have made him more vulnerable in this situation.
Right, and Dr. Isaac goes on to say that this disease, combined with the medication Edwards was taking, could have even impacted his impulse control. So it makes you wonder, did these things play a role in his actions?
And that's where this case, it becomes more than just a legal case, right? It becomes about accountability, sure, but also about mental health and how much it factors into decision-making. How much do we take those vulnerabilities into account?
That's the tightrope the justice system has to walk, I guess. Balancing the need for punishment with the possibility of, rehabilitation for the individual. And in this case, it seems like the judge was really trying to consider both sides.
Which brings us to, I guess, the most anticipated part of this deep dive, the sentencing. What did the judges decide after all of this? So after all that, all the evidence, the arguments, the psychology, what did the judge land on? What's the sentence?
Okay, so the judge handed down a sentence of 6 months imprisonment, and this is important. It was specifically for the Category A images.
Yeah.
But there's a but, right? This sentence was suspended for 2 years.
Suspended. So hold on. Does that mean he didn't actually go to prison?
You got it. It's like a pause button on the sentence. If Edwards meets certain conditions, the whole 6 months behind bars, that just goes away.
Okay, so what are these conditions? What does he have to do to avoid prison?
Two main things. Number one, a treatment program, and we're not talking about a weekend seminar here. This is a 40-day sex offender treatment program. It's designed to address the root causes, the behaviors, and hopefully reduce the risk of him, ever doing this again.
Wow, 40 days. That's intense. What's the other requirement?
So on top of the program, there's 25 sessions of something called a rehabilitation activity requirement. Think of it as RAR for short. It's about changing harmful behaviors, helping him reintegrate into society, that kind of thing. Could be all sorts of activities, really, but all focused on getting to the why of his actions.
It really does seem like the judge was aiming for rehab here, not just punishment. Why do you think that was the approach?
Well, if you look at the judge's remarks, they talk about how, while the charges are serious, incredibly serious, they didn't see Edwards as a direct threat to the public, specifically to children. So the priority became, how do we address this behavior? How do we prevent it from happening again, rather than just locking them up?
But, I mean, it wasn't all just therapy and second chances, was it? There were some pretty serious strings attached to this suspended sentence.
Oh, absolutely. The judge was crystal clear. If Edwards messes up, if he violates any of the terms, he's going straight to prison for those 6 months, no question.
Yeah.
Another offense, failing to comply with the program, anything like that, and his prison time.
A real second chance, but with a huge consequence hanging over his head if he doesn't follow through.
Exactly. And it's worth pointing out that the prosecution actually wanted to go further than this suspended sentence. They were pushing for what's called an SHPO, a sexual harm prevention order. But this one would have been indefinite. We're talking serious restrictions, limited internet, no contact with kids, the works.
Wow, okay. So did the judge go for that?
Right.
Indefinite restrictions on top of everything else?
They did not,
Yeah.
actually. The judge brought up the expert testimonies, both the psychiatrist and that psychosexual therapist we talked about. Both of them had assessed Edwards as, and this is a quote, low risk for reoffending. So the judge felt that the sentence, combined with his ongoing mental health treatment, that was enough to keep the public safe.
We've covered a lot of ground here today, haven't we? More than just the details of the case, but like the bigger questions it raises. The media, mental health, how we hold people accountable. It's complicated stuff.
It's a good reminder that these headlines, they have people behind them, real stories,
Yeah.
and it's rarely black and white. We can't condone what he did, of course, but this case makes you think about all the factors involved,
It's definitely a case for the digital age, isn't it? I mean, online exploitation, the impact it has, it's something we're all grappling with. And while the court's made its decision here, that conversation about accountability, about what rehabilitation looks like, how mental health plays into all of this, well, that's a conversation that's going to continue far beyond this courtroom.